As we return our attention to the Crusades, let's give thought to the aftermath of the success of the First Crusade. The Holy Land was divided up into territories and claimed by various of the leading crusaders. We know that Godfrey of Bouillon took on the title of protector of the Holy Sepulchre, but his brother, Baldwin I, claimed to be king of Jerusalem. There were also feudal lands developed around other territories in the Holy Land, Edessa and Nicaea, and so on and so forth. And the feudal lords established a Latin kingdom in the Holy Land, but in order to maintain their particular share, many times they would fight each other and would actually ally themselves with Muslim generals in order to defend themselves. And so you can see that we're not finding the unity that we might expect in this Latin kingdom. Instead, it's just the feudal divisions of the West brought to the East. And so the Westerners declined in their strength, in their unity, in their preparedness for war, and the Muslims at the same time, now that they were no longer surprised by the advances of the Crusaders, they built up their defenses and returned on the offense. And so that is what's going to generate this next crusade and really ongoing crusades in the future. The Second Crusade was inspired when in 1144 Muslims recaptured Edessa. And so Bernard of Clairvaux, whom we've talked about before, the great Cistercian leader, the great preacher, began to call upon the Western Knights to rise up and defend the Holy Land. And so he encouraged a second crusade, a second wave of the crusade. In 1147, German and French armies marched to the Holy Land, but they had no successes whatsoever. These crusades were defeated at Edessa, at Laodicea, and Damascus, and so they returned in disgrace. Bernard, being the very effective preacher that he was not dismayed. He simply turned their failures into sermons on judgment for their sin. And so he preached for revival in the hopes of preparing the Crusaders for their next wave of crusades. Now, the Third Crusade, it was motivated when Saladin, the great Muslim general, arose and developed power, authority, and armies in Israel. In 1187, Saladin led the Muslim forces against the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. I've seen Hattin. It's actually called the Horns of Hattin because of two peaks in the distance, but the plains of Hattin were the site of a major battle. Unfortunately, the Crusaders were overconfident and they went out into the hot sun of July without sufficient water. And so they became dehydrated, even hallucinated. They were delusional and easily defeated by Saladin's better prepared armies. And so with that defeat, there really was no one to defend Jerusalem. And you can see in this illustration how the Muslim armies laid siege to Jerusalem, and ultimately there was no hope except to yield the city to the Muslims. This event, the Battle of Hattin, is at the center of a film called the Kingdom of Heaven. Stars Orlando Bloom of Legolas, Lord of the Rings fame, one of his early starring projects. I cannot recommend the film. It's rated R. Too much sex, too much violence, but nonetheless it does portray the crusading spirit, and it shows the hopelessness of the Crusaders once they lose at Hattin, and ultimately it shows the surrender of Jerusalem to the Muslims. And so this sets the stage for the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade is called the Crusade of Three Kings, and they're called upon to head to the east, take up the cross, and defeat Saladin and regain Jerusalem. The first king was Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa, which means Redbeard. He was the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany. All right, Philip II was Philip Augustus of France. And the third king was Richard the Lionheart of England. These three kings headed to the Orient, all right, and there they took up the cross against the Muslims. Well, at first they had success. Frederick defeated the Muslims at Iconium, but then as his army tried to cross the river at Iconium, he grew careless, impatient, and as he tried to swim, he drowned trying to swim across the river. He was, after all, nearly 70 years old, which is as old as I am, and I can tell you that's foolishness to try to swim the river, but he was such a macho man. He was going to show his men that he could do it. Well, unfortunately, he had a heart attack in the middle of the river and died. And therefore, his armies grew weary and discouraged, and they left. The French armies under Philip participated in a victorious siege of Acre, and this was a major victory for the Crusaders. Acre became the most important Crusader city in the Holy Land after the loss of Jerusalem. Acre was a coastal city, and there the Crusaders could receive supplies. They could send back their loot. They made their headquarters there for both their religious and political leaders. So Acre, very important city, and so this is a very important victory on behalf of the Crusaders. But once Philip had victory at the siege of Acre, then he departed for France. There he hoped to take Normandy back from England while Richard was on crusade. Where is the protection of Peter and Paul and the church? Not there, okay? The church should not make promises that they cannot keep. Richard, on his own, could not win back Jerusalem, but he did negotiate a treaty with Saladin to allow Christian pilgrimages. So at least there was something that was won out of the Third Crusade. Now, on his way back from the crusade, in 1192, he sailed for England. He was shipwrecked in Austria and was kidnapped by Duke Leopold. And so Leopold held him for ransom. After the ransom was paid, he returned to England in 1194, but there he found that John, his younger brother, had attempted a coup. And once he settled affairs with John, then he began war against Philip, because remember, Philip is attempting to steal Normandy away from England. The story goes that Richard was participating in a siege of Philip's castle when a random arrow was shot in the air and stuck Richard in the neck, and that was how he died. You know, there have been so many films about this time period, and there's one titled Robin Hood that stars Russell Crowe and um, Kate Blanchett. And in the first act of this show, we see the death of Richard by this random arrow. Well, this story of Richard, his captivity in Austria, the attempt by John to take over the nation of England, this, of course, is the background for the stories of Robin Hood and Ivanhoe. All right, I've already mentioned Robin Hood. This film was on Turner Classic Movies just this last weekend. I had to watch it for the umpteenth time just because I love this film. And it's an early Technicolor attempt, so my word, they have brought out all the color they could find for this film. Great film. About the same time, they did a movie, Ivanhoe. This one is less fun because Robert Taylor is just too stiff, not like Errol Flynn at all, but it does have the very beautiful Elizabeth Taylor and the almost as beautiful Joan Fontaine and the always smarmy, snarky George Sanders. So really, it's a good film, and it also tells the story of the captivity of Robin Hood. I'm sorry, the captivity of Richard the Lionheart and Prince John's attempt to overtake England, and then the final solution when Richard is returned to his throne through the efforts of Robin Hood and also Ivanhoe. Next, let's look at the Fourth Crusade. This may be the low point of the Crusades. Innocent III, one of the great popes of all time, sent this crusade against Saladin's headquarters in Egypt. But along the way, the Crusaders hired the Venetian fleet to carry them to Egypt, but the sailors demanded that the Crusaders go first to Constantinople. In Constantinople, the Venetians wanted the Crusaders to back their candidate for the new emperor, and they required the Crusaders' help before they would carry them to Egypt. Well, the Crusaders went to Constantinople. They did get involved in the election of the new emperor, but once they did that, you know, they looked around them and said, you know what? Look at this city. It is full of wealth and women. Why don't we just help ourselves? And so these Crusaders sacked and looted Constantinople, a Christian city full of Eastern Christians. And so what a disaster, what a tragedy, what a betrayal of the crusading impulse to attack the very city that you are intended to defend. Okay, now the Pope, Innocent III, was furious that the Crusaders had disobeyed his orders to go to Egypt. But when they reminded him that, oh, look, we've reunited the Eastern Church with the Western Church. And gee, Pope, you get to be Pope over all of Christendom again. And so he kind of settled into the new reality. But it wasn't to last. In 1261, the Byzantines recaptured their capital from the Western Crusaders. But at this point, the hostility between the East and the West was greater than ever. So Urban's hope that Christendom would be reunited, that was forever lost by the errors of the Fourth Crusade. Now, we're not going to say anything about the Fifth and Sixth Crusades. Not much happened. Both of them were aimed at Egypt and Tunisia, trying to get to the Muslims in their North African headquarters. But we're just going to skip over to the Children's Crusade, which took place in 1212. This was a tragic event. A young man named Stephen rallied 7,000 French children. They were actually teenagers by our reckoning. They're aged 12 to 18. But he had a dream that only the poor and the pure could accomplish what armed men could not, that is, the recapture of Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre. And so he led these thousands of children, these pilgrims, to the coast, but they were disappointed when God did not part the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, so that they could march to Jerusalem. So as they were stranded on the coast, many died of starvation and exposure, or there were ships that came to the port and offered to take them to the Holy Land, but instead captured them and sold them into slavery. There was a German boy, Nicholas, who led a similar unsuccessful venture, and we call these tragic events the Children's Crusades. Now, let's move on to the Seventh and Eighth Crusades. These are significant because they were both led by Louis IX, the King of France, who later was declared a saint. In fact, he is the only French monarch ever to be beatified by the church. Now, both crusades failed, and Louis died from dysentery. But he, as Saint Louis, is of course very famous now. And if you're ever in New Orleans, and many of you are, go to the French Quarter, go to the Jackson Square. You'll see St. Louis Cathedral, and you must enter in and look around. It's beautiful on the inside. The walls are adorned by stained glass windows that outline the life of Louis as he's in his childhood, his marriage, his coronation, his adventures in the Holy Land, and ultimately his death and his beatification. The apse up in the front with the altar has a mural of Louis and his armies leaving from Paris, heading to the east. Beautiful, and of course St. Louis has left his name on cities and just a number of places. So an important figure in the Crusades. All right, the next major event in the Crusades is 1291, when the Crusader city of Acre fell. As I said, it became the headquarters of the Crusaders, the headquarters of the orders of the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the last holdout in the Holy Land. The Muslims surrounded it on land and by sea. Ultimately, they destroyed the city, and the Crusaders escaped. Most of them simply returned to the west. Some settled on Cyprus and continued to have forays into the Holy Land, but essentially 1291 is the date of the end of the Eastern Crusade. The Muslims left Acre in rubble for centuries, but then came back and rebuilt a city there. It's called Akko today. All right, so 1291, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land ended. All right, let's talk about the results of the Crusades. All right, mistrust and enmity developed between the East and the West. They already had a schism between the two. And again, the crusade was an attempt to reunite the two, but instead they became even further alienated from each other. Muslims, Jews, and Christians also increased their hostility toward each other. At the same time, there was increased contact of the West with the Byzantine Empire, with the Eastern Orthodox Church, and with Islamic civilization. And so this contact is going to bring certain scholarly benefits to the West, as well as ultimately trade routes that will develop a new way of gaining wealth. The power and wealth of the papacy increased. Remember that they took charge of the estates of those of the Crusaders. Well, if the Crusaders didn't return, well, then the papacy overtook those lands. Their power increased as they were the ones to decide when the Crusades would take place or who would lead the Crusades. And they simply became wealthier through the increase of their power. But this is very important. In the aftermath of the Crusades, trade and commerce arose as a source of economy. As trade routes were developed, as markets were created for the products of the West and the East, then those who could develop the commerce between West and East became businessmen that became wealthy without the necessity of owning land. Okay, this is very important. A new source of income and wealth. There was an increased interest in relics, as you can imagine, because the Crusaders would bring home souvenirs and items that they claimed were holy, sacred relics of those who have gone before. Eventually, Martin Luther is going to claim that there were enough nails from the cross to shoe every horse in Saxony. All right, and so on and so forth. So a number of relics were returned, and at home, the crusading zeal turned toward fighting heresy. We're going to see that popes would call upon crusaders to attack their heretical enemies in South France, and they would promise the same benefits of the indulgences for those who would go on crusades against the Western heresies. All right, we want to talk about these orders, these military religious orders that developed during the Crusades. The Knights Hospitaller originally were called the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. Their original tasks were to take care of the pilgrims and the sick in the Holy Land, but they became a military order of knighthood, so that they also were fighters. Now, the other major military order were the Knights Templar, developed in 1128 and sponsored by Bernard of Clairvaux, who actually wrote their motto, their case for support. The Knights Templar originally were called the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Their poverty was depicted by their symbol, which was two knights riding on the same horse. Okay, because of their poverty, they had to share a horse. But this poverty did not last long. Initially, they were to protect Christians on pilgrimage, but ultimately they became military leaders. They fought in the Crusades. They were known as some of the greatest soldiers and military fighters in the East. But I will say that it was the Knights Templar who failed most miserably at the Battle of Hattin, which was the turning point in the Crusades. And so they had great victories, a great reputation, but unfortunately they also had some tremendous losses. But the greatest history of the Knights Templar is not connected to the battlefield, but to their genius in banking and transportation. All right, now let's think about again the feudal system of wealth tied to land. When a crusader left from the west to go to the east, he's leaving his source of wealth behind. So the Knights Templar developed a banking system whereby the Western Crusader could go to the Templar bank and get a letter of credit, okay, to cover his personal wealth, always paying a commission, right? Then he would carry that letter to the east, and in the east then he would turn in that letter of credit, receive gold that he can spend, but again paying a commission. All right, and so the Knights Templar actually developed the earliest system of banking. Now, to transport their wealth between the east and the west, the Knights Templar developed a fleet of ships, okay, and this fleet itself was of tremendous value and added to the wealth of this organization. Now, after 1291, after the departure of the Knights Templar from Acre and from the Holy Land, the Knights Templar actually lost their reason for being, okay? And yet they still had tremendous wealth. Back in France, King Philip, Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, but not fair at all. Philip IV was coveted this wealth of the Templars, and Philip sent out secret letters throughout his land to his agents wherever they were, and with orders to arrest the Templars all on the same day. All right, that day was October 13th in 1300, and that day was a Friday, Friday the 13th, and that is what has made that day unlucky until now. All right, and so Philip IV had all the Knights Templar arrested. Remember, his lackey was the Pope Clement the Fifth, and Clement had the Templars arrested elsewhere in England and Spain. In 1310, there were 54 Templars that were burned at the stake in Paris. Their crimes were homosexuality and witchcraft, trumped up charges against which they had no defense because the church and state were united in opposition to the Templars. In 1312, the Council of Venice disbanded the Templars. 1314, the last Templar Grand Master was burned at the stake. His name, Jacques de Molay. All right, and so the Templars disbanded, destroyed, their reputations ruined, many of them executed. But according to legend, their wealth undiscovered. Philip never did recover the wealth that he coveted. So we're still looking for it, right? And we're still looking for it in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, National Treasure, the Da Vinci Code, and so on. Now, legend tells us that the Freemasons, this secret society, actually developed out of the Knights Templar. Remember, the Knights Templar are named for the Solomon's Temple on the Temple Mount. And so the Knights Templar give inspiration to the Freemasons, who supposedly were those who were the Masons that built the temple. And so we have a number of legends attached to the Knights Templar, most of them not true. But what we do know is true is that they were a powerful, wealthy organization that defended the Holy Land, but then after the loss of the Holy Land, they were very important in establishing the banking industry and commerce. Okay, so even though they did not benefit from their efforts, nonetheless, others in this period of time did benefit from this new system of wealth and trade and commerce. Okay, let's talk about the aftermath of the Crusades. All the fears that had motivated the Crusades all came true after the Crusades failed. The Crusades only delayed the ultimate conquest of Constantinople by Muslim forces. Indeed, the Muslim forces were knocking on the door of Constantinople. Indeed, the Byzantine Empire needed the West to support them from the threat of Muslims. And when the Western Crusaders could no longer defend the East, in 1453, Muslim armies overran Constantinople, brought an end to the Byzantine Empire. 5 years later, Muslims conquered Athens and occupied Greece, thereby totally decimating the Eastern Empire, taking over the Christian presence in the East, dominating it then by Islam. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Muslim forces extended westward into Europe. Suleiman the Magnificent conquered Hungary. He reached as far as Vienna and laid siege to the city in 1529. He was turned back by Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. We will talk about him when we get to the Reformation. And because he had to turn his attention to the East and to the Muslims and their advance, he was unable to stop the advance of the Reformation in his home country. All right, but this is going on during the same time frame as the advance of the Reformation. And then in the next century, the Battle of Vienna in 1683 finally halted the Muslim advance into Europe. at least we can say of the Crusades that the delay brought about by the defense of the Crusaders strengthened Europe and their ability to resist, so that although Islam took over the Eastern Empire, nonetheless it was unable to extend further beyond Vienna into the rest of Europe. Now, here's a map that shows the Ottoman Empire in 1683, at the time when the Muslim advance into Europe was stopped. But you see that now, by this point, Europe has recovered Spain and even Morocco, but Islam still is occupying the rest of North Africa and Egypt, into the Israel, Syria, Iraq, and up into the Eastern Europe, Turkey, and then and here's further conquest of Eastern Europe, what is now Romania and Hungary, and so on. You can just see the map and see that they took over a large swath of territory. Now, the Ottoman Empire, as you see it, stood until World War I, but then they allied with Germany. When Germany and the Turks were defeated in the war, the empire was broken up and colonized by Britain and France, until this is what this region looked like later in the 20th century. You can see France in Morocco and Algeria. We have Britain is occupying Egypt. The Ottoman Empire has shrunk considerably, and we have Russia over here in the east. Italy is in charge of Libya, and so on and so forth. So you see that Europeans have invaded and occupied much of what had been Muslim territory. And so the Muslims' resentments festered throughout most of the 20th century until in 2001, Islamic aggression ends up with attacks on America through 9/11. The destruction of the World Towers, the Pentagon, the attempted destruction of the White House. 9/11 is an outgrowth of Islamic aggression that developed through tensions and resentments that festered following the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire and the occupation by European forces. Now, in response to 9/11, George Bush gathered around the first responders, and unfortunately his wording could have been better chosen, because he certainly wanted to establish a war on terror, a response to the Islamic terrorism that was threatening our nation, but he referred to it as a crusade. And so this placed it on religious grounds, as if again Christianity in the West was fighting Islam in the East, when in reality we have two national interests that are fighting each other: Islamic aggression and the Western response. How will it end? How can it end? Is there any solution other than continued and endless bloodshed? Well, of course, this is our prayer and hope, but it is important for us to understand how the Crusades developed back in the medieval era, how the impulses continued and developed in the aftermath of the Crusades, and how the Crusades still are having an impact on our worldwide situation even today. And so I hope that these lectures have been helpful to you to see the history of the Crusades and the impact the Crusades are having even today. All right? And so I still have one more lecture to show, and this will be a lecture just to kind of give you a travel tour of crusading castles. This is where the church history intersects with the Holy Land. So one more lecture to go. Please join me for that event.